together rather than imagine that we can prevail by breaking ourselves up into smaller and smaller groups.
Great. I wanted to turn more specifically to some current calls for decarceration in light of COVID-19. So you've cautioned us against using conventional dividing lines that mark nonviolent versus violent, or low risk versus high risk, in short, sympathetic versus unsympathetic. Some of these lines seem to be hardening with COVID-19. Can you explain why it's problematic to demand decarceration using these categories?
Well, first and foremost, we should always plan to win. And if we plan to win, we should ask ourselves, what happens next in the event of victory? And if what happens next in the event of victory is that the people who have been rightly released are the only ones who could ever be released, then we will not have won. Do I say leave people, everybody inside? Of course not. But I do say this. Most people who go to prison leave prison. Most people are not doing life sentences. There should not be any life sentences. And in most parts of the world, there aren't life sentences. But most people do leave prison. So rather than imagining that there is a magical line between less guilty and more guilty, or more innocent or less innocent, or more deserving or less deserving, or I will say violent and nonviolent, we should say, why not take seriously the fact that most people leave prison? Do a little bit of analysis to see that we could be closing prisons already and jails already if we just cut by 2 weeks and 3 weeks and 4 weeks, much less years, the kinds of sentences people are serving, and then move on to the work of undoing organized abandonment. As the example that I gave to you from Los Angeles County, this is not an impossible challenge. It did take a long time in Los Angeles. The next time shouldn't take as long. It shouldn't take as long because of what we learned. It shouldn't take as long because Los Angeles can model behavior that other polities can follow. Amilcar Cabral, who is one of the most important thinkers, organizers, leaders, revolutionaries of my consciousness, taught us, or cautioned us, I should say, against claiming easy victories. And he's absolutely right. That said, we should gather all of our victories and then stop and think about them and say, what is this victory going to make possible next? Why do these victories matter? Who have we abandoned? Who have we used our own capacity for organized violence against in order not to include them in victory? So I'll give an example from New York City. New York City plans to spend $11 billion building 4 new jails. This is the so-called Closed Rikers project. The mayor, yesterday or today, announced that the city budget, ravaged as it is by the effects of COVID-19, will shrink by $2 billion. $11 billion for prisons, $2 billion less for everything the city needs. This is really straightforward. The mayor can learn from Los Angeles County, do not build the new jails, close Rikers, use the resources, the money and human resources that would have gone into that entire array of carceral institutions that people would be organizing to close, just as people organized to close Rikers, which was opened because people organized to close the institution that preceded Rikers. The mayor and the city council can use the money for the well-being of a city that has indeed been ravaged by unemployment, ravaged by the highest number of deaths from COVID-19. How can that be? How can that be? Turning a corner has to happen now, because where life is precious, life is precious. A young organizer and thinker who has an entire story of his own to tell, called Micah Herskind, just published a piece in which he argues really beautifully about, what is this high risk, low risk, no risk? There are humans, period. There are humans, period. The late Randy Martin wrote a wonderful book about risk some years ago, in which he said the world is under neoliberalism is dividing into these two categories: people who are at risk, so they get locked up, and people who can bear risk, so they get mortgages. And we can see now, with the economic collapse that is hastened by the kind of political leadership and normalized thinking, which is to say the domination, if not hegemony, of neoliberalism, tells us that where life is not precious, life is not precious, and that is the corner we have to turn.
Yeah. As the death counts have been rising, people have called on your definition of racism as a way to name and to understand what's happening right now. You've written that racism is, quote, the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Can you elaborate?
Well, that's already a mouthful, but let me see what I can do. I will be happy to elaborate. And the first thing I want to say about that definition is to caution people about falling into the trap of the performance effect. And what do I mean? I mean, people look at me and say, oh, in the United States, she's Black. That means if she talks about racism, she's talking about what happens to Black people. Or they think, oh, that definition means Black people have it the worst. No. What that definition tries to do, and seems to do for people as far in as varied places as Australia and Argentina and Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, many, many places where people have operationalized that definition to try to think about what's happening in the world. What the definition helps them do is to think about the design of things, the design of relationships, whether the relationships be to jobs, to housing, to transportation, to health, to the justice system, to security in gender identity, to age, to vulnerability in old age, and well-being as children. That this definition lets people start to think systematically so that it's possible to see how various groups come into being, and therefore then become naturally available for organizing and struggle. That's what that definition's for. So I'll give you some examples. The design of the public health system in the United States, and I think this is true throughout a good deal of the overdeveloped world, as well as a good deal of the world that, although dominated by resource extraction, still went through several rounds of governmental organization in the 20th century that put into place large-scale, complex governmental institutions designed to extract value from labor and land. So things like public health. Right? Public health was such a project of elites in the 20th century. And so the design of public health, as we learn from people like Nyan Shah and Samuel Kelton Roberts and others, laid out a framework of care and disregard that itself has amplified over time, so that if today we say certain kinds of people are more likely to have underlying conditions that make them vulnerable to COVID-19 death, the issue is not, is there something objectively pathological about a person or a group of people, but rather how has the design of a public health system and the wherewithal to enliven it in practice brought some people in and pushed some people out over time. So tomorrow afternoon at, I think at 2:30 in Eastern time, US time, Kenyon Farrell, long-time organizer, AIDS activist, economic justice activist, just activist, once upon a time critical resistance organizer, will be in conversation with Tamara Nopper, the visionary sociologist who is the best at thinking about data and thinking data visualization for the purpose of strengthening people and movements. So that conversation will happen tomorrow. And I want to say something else in thinking about my definition of racism, and that is that we must all beware bad statistics, as the statistical analyst and educator Ivory Toldson tells us over and over again. We have to beware of bad statistics and at the same time beware of the presumption that to recite vulnerability is somehow persuasive. If we say 50% of or 3% as against 1%, that somehow that's going to persuade people to action. That, in my experience, especially years ago when I was doing some outreach work with young people in high school who we were trying to kind of bring into the early days of critical resistance abolition, and I and others talked to a group of mostly brown and black young people, and one of their teachers said, well, 1 in 3 young black men is going to go to prison, right? Well, first of all, it turned out that statistic didn't hold any water. But let us even say it was true. What young person sitting in the auditorium in 1998 would be encouraged to listen and act if these scoldy older people came in and said, you are doomed. You are doomed. So to go back to what the purpose of my definition of racism is, the purpose of the definition is to enable people to think about collectivities whose vulnerability might then lead to joining forces in order to overcome that vulnerability and do something else. Example is water. Everywhere around the planet, people are struggling over water. So at the moment, in the Navajo Nation has become a hotspot for COVID-19, in part because of the scarcity of water. People can't do this simple thing we're all told to do, which is wash our hands. The Navajo Nation obviously brings to mind then the people who had organized at Standing Rock and the No DAPL pipeline people who have been trying to get people to understand that the anti-pipeline organizing has everything to do with protecting the land and particularly protecting water. So that struggle and the struggle that produces, or the vulnerability around inadequate water that produces likelihood of premature death connects the Navajo Nation with Flint, Michigan, and with Detroit, and the work that the Detroit Justice Center is doing with people in Australia, where especially after the fires of last year, the problem of adequate water and adequate nutrition is quite enormous. The fact that Cape Town, the city of Cape Town in South Africa, has been on the verge of running out of water for some time now. On the verge of running out of water for some time now, and so forth. So all of these concerns about water, thought through the lens of my definition of racism, I hope provide people with a sense of the opportunity to join forces to fight racism by fighting for water, to fight racism by fighting against prison, to fight racism by fighting for housing, rather than to fight against people's attitudes. I don't really care what anybody thinks of me as long as they stay out of my way.
Yes. Okay, so I am going to bring in some audience questions. Before I do, I wanted to remind everyone about some upcoming Haymarket events. Again, on Sunday, Krista Franklin's superb new book of poetry and images, Too Much Midnight. And that launch is being hosted by Mahogany L. Brown. And on Wednesday, a teach-in on the remaking of schools in the time of coronavirus with Waynow, Jesse Hagopian, and Noliwe Rooks. And on Thursday, a week from today, Arundhati Roy in conversation with Amani Perry. You can register for all at Eventbrite, and you can check them out at Haymarket on their webpage. Haymarket is doing really incredible work, crucial work that's feeding the international left and the radical imagination. If you're in a position to make a donation, no matter how small, please consider giving to Haymarket through Venmo and at haymarketbooks.org, and consider giving to abolitionist groups like Critical Resistance at criticalresistance.org. So Ruthie, maybe I'll give you a couple questions and you can select as you feel your appetite. Karen Aguilar San Juan asks, does abolition also apply to war? And I thought possibly you could elaborate also the military-industrial complex and how you're thinking about the prison-industrial complex. That's one for the taking, if you'd like. There are also a few really good questions that are asking for just some more breaking down of what is meant by decarceration, and if there's a meaningful contrast here that you're trying to draw between decarceration and abolition.
Okay, well, let me take Karen's an old friend from way back. I will take that question. We haven't seen each other in 10 years, maybe? Yeah, 10 years. 10 years. War, absolutely. So let me talk a little bit about the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex. And it's really kind of interesting that we've gotten this far in our discussion, and I think had not said prison-industrial complex once, which is kind of great. So some of us, inspired mainly by Mike Davis in an article he published in The Nation in 1994, I think, maybe 5, started to think about what we didn't yet call mass incarceration. So we started to think about how come there are so many people in prison, and how come there are so many new laws, and how come the sentences have gotten so long, and how come there are so many new prisons everywhere. So those were all the questions that animated us. Mike asked the question, is there a prison industrial complex? And in playing off the concept of military industrial complex, he was inviting people to think about things that I even think he might not have thought about at the outset, which is to say, if we think about the military industrial complex, we think not only about the people who go to war, but we have to think about the intellectuals who design the public policy that determines when the U.S., for example, will use diplomacy and when it will send troops. It means that the military-industrial complex means all of the people, engineers and designers and ordnance makers and so forth, who design the machinery of industrialized killing. And then the Pentagon that contracts for the machinery of industrialized killing to be made and made ready. The military-industrial complex includes all of the bases spread around the United States and around the world. Around the world. There are more than 800 US bases around the world. It's not the only military around the world, but there is no military that has such a wide representation on the surface of the planet than the US military. The military-industrial complex also includes all of the people who are, residents of towns that are near bases, and the boosters who want to have more of the jobs that for civilians that come with the bases, and the people who work in the factories that make the ordnance and the bombs and so on and so forth. All of that is the MIC. And if all of that is the military-industrial complex, the people who make the laws, the people who design the policies, the people who design the weapons, the people who are actually uniformed and civilian personnel, who enliven the whole thing. By extension, the prison-industrial complex has the same complexity, and that is not to muddy the water, but rather to clarify that there are all these different places to fight. That we can fight in rural America, where people, in many cases, welcomed new prisons, thinking the prison was going to bring jobs and save their rural hospital. Neither thing happened. Or the people who imagined that the only kind of future they can have as first-generation college students is to major in criminal justice of one kind or another and hope to become a police officer or a prison guard or a worker in that environment rather than a teacher or an artist or something else that the same amount of education could produce. Uses of land, uses of resources, uses of money, and relationships between and among people are all involved in prison industrial complex. So that's a long wind up to saying, in answer to Karen's question, absolutely. Abolition really does require that we change one thing, which is everything, which is what the title of that book is about. Everything. So there are some young from my point of view, I just turned 70, but some young lawyers, legal scholars, and also practicing lawyers, including a young woman who is doing a postdoc at Cornell, who have been doing all kinds of legal work in the various hot zones of the so-called war on terror around the world for a long time. For example, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border and in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. And this one particular young lawyer, Zora Ahmed, said, I think that the principles of abolition, as I have come to understand them through the combination of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, put together with critical resistance, gives us the basis for thinking about how to take abolition into the most difficult struggles outside of prison and detention, which are the struggles from ground to the air of hot war, and the complexities of those struggles. That, as she put it, it's not as though we can say there's a drone which is bad and everyone on the ground who's not. Rather, all of these relations have gotten so messed up over time that we have to sort them out, and that is the way to sort them out. So yes, abolition does, in a word, extend to war.
There are a lot of really excellent, smart, non-trolly audience questions. Zach Stiles asked, how can abolitionist praxis be applied by folks in the U.S. to support Palestinians under occupation?
Well, Zach, you probably already know the answer to this question. And if you were sitting in front of me, I would ask you to answer it. There is so much mutual aid that extends across the barriers of occupation, of war, of struggle that goes in both directions. So it's not as though people in the United States are exclusively in the position to offer help, that people who are in the occupied territories are exclusively in the position to require help. I don't think that that is the way to think, and I know for a fact that that's not how things have gone. So, for example, during the very, very active days in Ferguson, Missouri, at the time that Black Lives Matter was becoming more and more a feature of how people understood the need to protest without cessation over the fact of police killings of people in this country. Young people, and people of all ages, I should say, in Ferguson, learned from people in solidarity in Palestine how to deal with tear gas. So that's just one example. There are other examples as well. But I think perhaps the heart of the question is, how can we reach through walls that seem to be so solid? You know, what are the modes of communication, of solidarity, of struggle that we can put into practice? And to come back to the US, and I'm not turning my back in any way on Palestine, a place I visited, 30 years ago, almost to the week, is to talk about how some of the very small things that people do, if they're done persistently, start to add up to something bigger. So, for example, to go back to that concept, survival pending abolition. Survival pending abolition. The fact not only that people have worked very, very hard to create bail funds and other money resources to help people get out of being locked up, but also that people are sending care packages inside and sending them over and over and over again so that people who are inside, who are not expecting to be bailed or to be released anytime soon, can have some of what they need to safeguard their lives. And what comes with the care package is the fact of care. And this is not a small thing, it's a big thing. The solidarity is built in care. And I don't mean a kind of sentimental, although sometimes sentiment's okay, but a sentimental, oh, I care about you because you are needy. Because as I said at the beginning of our conversation, neither contempt nor pity is going to get us anywhere. Rather, the constant interactions that come from sending in care packages or teaching in a program or writing to people who are in occupied territories or being in solidarity with the women's artist group in Rio de Janeiro that is organizing the favelas against Bolsonaro on the one hand and the various paramilitaries on the other, means that we build the kind of communication and trust, which is to say we know that people will be there again when we need them to do more, So some examples of this sort of work over the years have included the kind of ongoing effort that people like Jerry Silva have done in Los Angeles, where she has helped to form one organization after another, being absolutely undaunted by what seems to be an insurmountable problem, which is to say the problem of how to end mass incarceration and end detention. And as well, the problem of solidarity means that we have a promise built into it. And the promise is to think about the edges of our struggle, not as limits, but as the beginning of the next struggle as well. That an edge is also an interface. So if we want to think after borders, then we have to live as though borders can go.
Yes. Some really excellent questions on Indigenous liberation and the Indigenous struggle. One from Margot Tamez, who asks, is it possible for the decarceration movement and abolitionist practice to be applied to the Indigenous struggle against the so-called border wall and logics of settler colonial dispossession and erasure?
That's a great question. My friend Nick Estes has written a little bit about this in a piece that, well, at least in one version of a piece that he published in Leopold Lambert's journal, The Funambulist. And Nick's piece is called Freedom is a Place. And full disclosure, that phrase, freedom is a place, comes from my work. And Nick does the work. Nick, who's one of the founders of Red Nation, who's based in Albuquerque these days, from Dakota, it's Lakota. Nick does the work of showing how Indigenous struggles for decolonization and is abolitionist, or abolitionist struggle must be decolonial. I teach in a decolonial summer school every year. I don't know if we'll meet this year because of COVID. And this is an ongoing discussion that I have with activists and intellectuals from around the planet. We talk about the continuum of abolition and decolonization, rather than that abolition is one set of struggles that have to do with people regaining their freedom in the context of a nation state that doesn't go away, and decolonization is a separate struggle because it's a struggle for people to undo the colonial presence that has structured their lives for generations. These things must come together to make freedom be a place.
You're getting some questions about current upticks in repression, in surveillance. So one question comes in the form of, what are we to make of the current situation of suspending civil liberties to prevent the spread of COVID and the associated police enforcement of COVID-related legislation? And then a related question from Catherine Dace: can you comment on the increasing trend towards home arrest and incarceration via surveillance technologies?
Sure, and the latter question actually informs any answer to the former question, and that is, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the importance of planning to win. And for many people, for good reason, the idea of making sure that loved ones, or indeed for individuals, they themselves, would not be locked up in a building somewhere else with bars on the windows and bars on the doors and all of that, led to or enabled the expansion of what my friend James Kilgore calls e-carceration, electronic carceration. So years ago, when I was trying to put together a talk about this, and I Googled, ankle shackle, but what you Google actually is ankle bracelet, like it's jewelry rather than shackle, which is what it is. When I Googled it, it always turned up Martha Stewart. Like Martha Stewart, famous felon, blonde, rich felon, white woman, felon. And so the idea that, this is a much preferable way to be incarcerated because you can be at home, and how much better is that than to be in a cell with somebody, quickly showed itself to be the nightmare that it is. That the lives of people who are subjected to incarceration are incredibly shrunken, although they are living in their own homes or their parents' homes or their whoever is taking them in. Their scope of activity is extremely limited, and they are not only not actually living a life for which they are responsible, such as parents for their children, or children for their aging parents, or workers for their jobs. But also, the fact of incarceration is a cost to the person who's wearing the shackle. And it takes, essentially, it's an insatiable system that sucks time and money from individuals, households, and communities. So Maya Shenmore and Vicki Law have just written a book about this, published by the New Press. It just came out, I think, last week, called Prison by Another Name, I think is the title. But you can learn about that. And so the spread of this kind of surveillance, control, arrest, I think, is likely unless we organize against it. Probably the most important word I've used all evening is organize. Organize, organize, organize. Everything else is noise.